ideas editor for Barron's Magazine. This is our second to last session of this event, so we're almost there, and we're gonna do our best to make this as exciting for everyone who needs coffee. As a way of introducing everyone, I'm just gonna sort of jump in here with a quick and easy question for everybody. And I wanna go around the room and I'm gonna ask all of you, the virtual room as well, just to characterize the state of the metaverse economy right now in one word, and you can explain it, in a sentence afterwards, and we won't hold you to it, but you can tell us that it's booming because there's so much opportunity if you want to be really boring, or you can find something more interesting to say. So let's start online. Let's start with Ash Richter, who is the principal for innovation and ventures at BHP. Ash, how would you characterize?
I'm going to go with budding, and give you a visual of a sort of a budding flower. It's there, it's there, it's going to bloom.
I love it. All right. Our other online guest, let's go to Marília Maciel, Marília and Maciel, am I getting that right? And she is the digital senior policy researcher at DiploFoundation. All right, give us your answer here.
I would go for intriguing and uncertain. I think there are many unanswered questions, although this event helps to answer, or at least to raise some good questions.
Okay, unanswered questions, I like it. Daniel Castro, Vice President of the Information Technology and Information Foundation.
Yeah, I'd say it's, the way I think about it is maybe a few years before a potential gold rush. So there's a lot of people who think there's a gold rush that's going to happen. There's a lot of people who think they're crazy, and we're waiting to see which it is.
I'm going to call that pre-gold rush, to give you an actual word. That's one word. Okay. And finally, Cody Ankeny, you are the Reality Labs policy manager at Meta. So give us a word.
Yeah, I'm going to stay on theme and go with early. I think it actually doesn't, depending on how you define the metaverse, it doesn't actually exist yet in like real, cross-platform terms. But the seed is there.
Okay. Good. So let's talk then about the state of innovation for this early stage budding economy. So the thing that I've been thinking about as we've been hearing from lots of people is the sort of mix of competition in this industry between big companies like the one represented by the gentleman down the table from me, Meta, and lots of other companies. And this is sort of one of the big economic questions, is how these relationships between big companies and small companies are going to develop. And so, Cody, maybe I will start with you by just asking you if you think that the metaverse is going to, quickly become the property of companies like yours, or are we going to see lots and lots of innovation? And if so, what will that competition look like?
Yeah, I think it's a really good and interesting question. And it just makes me think, so one of the first things Mark Zuckerberg said when he changed the name of the company to Meta was that we're not building the metaverse, we're building for the metaverse. And that really goes to kind of the fundamental vision, I think, of how we're thinking about what we're building. And when I think there's a lot of buzzwords around this. We've talked about it a lot, kind of thought about what is the metaverse. And then I want to break it down to kind of just really two things that differentiate it from what exists today. The first thing is all of this, XR, we've been talking about it, VR, AR, these new ways to interface with the digital world that's more immersive and all of that. I think we talked about that quite a bit. The second piece is unprecedented interoperability, another thing that's been talked about a lot. But I think that this is really the thing that differentiates what the vision of the metaverse is versus what exists today. Because right now we have a lot of platforms that don't really talk to each other. If you own something on one platform, you can't take it to another one. But the vision of the metaverse is cross-platform. That's why we talk about the metaverse, not the metaverses, because it is this kind of unified thing, just the same way we don't say the internets, right? We say the internet. And what I think this means for our company and for kind of the future state of the economy is that companies are going to be competing for creators. They're not going to have this locked-in ecosystem where they own the metaverse. It's going to be based on this creator economy, because creators are going to be able to take the value of what they created with them across platforms. And so the companies that are successful are the ones that create this space for creators to move in and out of their platform, but also have the tools to be able to create the things that attract, the most economic activity, where they can find their audiences on that platform. So that's a lot of how we're thinking about the future state of the metaverse, and that's why when there is, I'm sure there's going to be a place for big companies, but I think that there's also going to be a big space for individuals and small groups of creators and other companies that are going to interface with the big companies in different ways to create their own kind of tailored experiences that people can use.
Ash, I want to throw this over to you. Do you have any thoughts to add on this question?
Yeah, sure. I think we're definitely going to see some monopolies right out the gate, but that they won't necessarily be long-lived. I think one of the ways I like to think about the metaverse that I think terrifies a lot of people is that intrinsically it's a surveillance system. And I say this having just left the intelligence community, defense community, and it is a tracking system because you need to be content in it in order to be interactive with all of the different components. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think that that's where it gets really interesting in terms of moving away from any form of current or future company setting up monopoly to essentially build that permanent record that one of the earlier panels kind of mentioned of like your kids in school, right? You already have that record being built up. When we were in school, we're getting threatened with like, oh no, this will go on your permanent record. We will have those permanent records. We increasingly already do, but we're going to be moving away from letting that just go off into the ether, letting something else monetize that. And I think that that's where the metaverse and Web 3.0 have that bit of Venn diagram that Alvin showed up earlier. I'm going to say this evening because I'm in Australia and it's a trip doing this the other way around, but time-wise, and that's really good, interesting, because I think if we can flip to a self-sovereign identity-based kind of mechanism, which is one of the components of Web 3.0 that crosses over into the metaverse really nicely, if we can economize that and let people control the actual money flows of them as content, them as data points for the system to actually work itself, then it moves away from a monopoly. Then it moves maybe into the hand of data brokers as another layer of monopoly, which might be a little concerning, but at the very least, it would be something that an individual would have ultimate control over.
Ash, it's the middle of the night for you, right? So if you need to take a nap in the middle of this panel.
No, that's okay. I was going to take a nap during the lunch break, and then it just was too interesting to go the Q&A without when came back. So I'm good.
All right, we'll try to keep it interesting. Daniel, I want to know what your thoughts are initially on like the regulatory environment. Ash is raising a lot of questions about identity, data brokers, complicated policy issues around which, like at least in this country, we've not done a lot of regulation. What do you think? What is the landscape now? What do you think needs to happen in order to enable innovation?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's really important is we have regulatory humility here, right? So just like we have to say that we don't know what the technology future is, I think regulators need to acknowledge that as well. And I saw some comments yesterday, for example, from the chair of the FTC, who was saying that already they're looking at dominance in the metaverse and what they need to be doing in this space, and that to me is risky. I mean, it's easy to think now, the dominant firms now are going to be the dominant firms in the future. Clearly, that didn't work out for Sears or Blockbuster or MySpace or BlackBerry, right? RIM. There are all these companies that were leaders in their industry that saw the future coming and still were able to succeed in it. And so, to start with maybe kind of your initial question there, I think there will be big companies that will dominate the marketplace in the future. It just might not be the big companies that we have today, or it could be spin-offs of them, or it could be startups. And so I think when we're thinking about regulation, that has to be one of the driving factors, is that there's so much we don't know today. And just like we're kind of laughing about, well, what term do we use, metaverse or spatial computing? Or, if we have, think about a regulatory policy for the metaverse, that might sound as antiquated as, regulatory policy for the internet superhighway, the way people were describing things in the past, or for surfing the web because you want to surf safely. Like, all these terms that just really don't make sense anymore. So, I mean, that doesn't mean we should be naive and blind to the fact that there are, we're going into this knowing there are a lot of issues we have to care about. We have to care about, children's privacy. We have to care about safety. We have to care about, antitrust concerns, and we have to care about how data is used. All these questions, and we can start thinking about those now. We can start responding quicker because we know the implications of ignoring these issues. But that doesn't mean we should try and regulate before we know where there are actual problems. So I think my main thought there is, to the extent that the less can be, let's make evidence-based policy. I think that's the main message going forward.
Marília, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think the metaverse depends on a layered ecosystem to operate, and the concentration on these other layers, that will influence the way that the metaverse will develop to a good extent. The layers below the metaverse include telecom infrastructure, human digital interfaces such as wearables, and decentralization enabling technologies. And with the exception of blockchain, we have seen a process of concentration in all these layers throughout the years due to vertical integration and also horizontal integration. So it's easy to envision a future in which platforms, especially social media, which already have a faithful mass of users due to economies of scale, are front runners in the metaverse space as well. But we look at the layers above and running on top of the metaverse, perhaps we will have a very different scenario, because the metaverse could provide an opportunity for new players in the creative economy, for instance, such as people working on design, game developers. It provides an opportunity for assets trading, e-commerce providers, but these providers will need to adjust to the terms of use of the platform to be able to operate in each metaverse. Therefore, at the same time, I think that we can expect that to some extent, the gatekeeping logic that we see in the internet platforms could continue to exist via contractual agreements in the metaverse. From a competition standpoint, in my opinion, we cannot compare the metaverse to the internet entirely. We cannot call it the new internet because the internet was technically built on open and interoperable protocols and on principles such as permissionless innovation. These features have made the internet what it is, the space for innovation that it is. And the industry vision of a fully interconnected and interoperable metaverse is not here yet. NFTs are seen as enablers of this vision because they are based on technical standards that are interoperable, and they can be exchanged in secondary markets for tokens. So they have between applications rather than in applications value. While this is true, we need to bear in mind that interoperability and openness are two different concepts that should not be confused. So interoperability can take place among players that are already dominant in the market, while openness presupposes the right conditions for entrants to compete. Moreover, interoperability is not just about economic value traveling across metaverses, but also about people traveling across some metaverses. And the legal corpus that we receive since birth, such as, for instance, privacy. You are protected as an European citizen by the GDPR, no matter where you live. This legal corpus needs to travel with you through the metaverse. And this is the kind of interoperability that we need to look at as well.
Ash, I wanted to ask you, since you have worked at essentially a venture firm, you worked at Incutel, right? You've worked on the funding side of this. Like, to what extent do companies, are they building for interoperability? Like, does that, early stages of gold rush, like, obviously, I think most of us as human beings want that world to exist, but is that what's actually getting built right now?
I'm going to lean into a big no. And I think this is one of the current challenges with getting big companies, small companies, governments, everybody on board with even the system itself. The system won't really do as much as it could do or earn everybody as much return of investment on digitizing all of their things and turning their workflows into part of metaverse layers if it's not interoperable. But that's not necessarily the plan, because I think in our sort of super capitalist society, everybody does want their they're super kind of their own piece of the pie. And I think that's dangerous. And I think that that's one of the fundamental flaws. And I think even the philosophy of the build right now is that we're thinking of it as this nation's version of the metaverse versus this nation's versus this company's versus companies, when it does need to be this. I'm not even sure I have a word for it. I know there were a couple of sort of philosophers at the turn of the last century that proposed essentially like everything being all interconnected along these lines, and they had a variety of terms, none of which have really made it into the list of mirror world, metaverse, spatial computing. But I think we always need to look at it like that. But right now, no, I don't think people are necessarily focusing on interoperability as much as they could do. But I think that ensuring that that's the case, ensuring, and actually, do you know who's a good example of this? This is actually part of why I've moved to Australia. The digital infrastructure here for how you deal with an ID, how you deal with your taxes, how you deal with the DMV or your health record, it's part of a centralized system. And its basis is it's digital policy like that sets in place this base level interoperability that means that companies in Australia will eventually be able to move faster, connecting the dots between what they have as HR records, what they have as biomedical records of any tracking they're doing of their employees for safety reasons or things along those lines, with the larger government records, and actually be able to kind of be like, oh, you're walking through this, you're doing your work training, you're doing this thing, and here's how it connects back to the whole of you, and figuring out where the guards are and the gates are. These things have to be interoperable, but right now, not so much.
So I just want to say programmatically, you're all raising a bunch of really interesting ideas, and if anybody wants to respond here, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Otherwise, I'll just keep pinging on whatever strikes me as interesting. But Cody, I wanted to go to you on this question of, so one of the things you're working on at Meta is enabling creators, as I understand it. You're working off of a vision that is ideally more interoperable. So talk about it. Talk about what you're seeing practically day to day as you're working in this.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, based on what we've heard already, I think it's pretty clear interoperability is really hard, really technically challenging, and it's hard. There are economic incentives to not be interoperable. That's why a lot of companies aren't interoperable today. But I do think that there's some degree, I think people can see the way the market is moving, and there's just more consumer desire to have more interoperability, have more ability to be an individual creating on a platform and being cross-platform, having an audience that can follow you across platform. But it's going to be a long road for sure, and we're definitely not anywhere near there. I see kind of two different models of ways that interoperability can happen, and one is I think a lot of companies and governments can get together and maybe agree on some interoperable standards that can make some like specific types of items or specific types of information interoperable. Standards are really helpful for that, but they are very specific and very technical. So there has to be a whole suite of standards that's going to be developed over a very long period of time. And many different countries have different views of how standards should be created and what role does government versus business play, how voluntary versus required should standards be. And so that's going to be really challenging. And that has been the story of the last 10 or 20 years, I think, for the tech industry and talking about standards. There's also kind of this world that somewhat mirrors what we have today, where companies make kind of bilateral agreements, or with groups of companies, they make these preferential agreements where, okay, I'll recognize your information, your stuff if you recognize mine. And that is a possibility way forward. I think that's probably not an optimal way forward. That does kind of lock out small producers because they're not part of that ecosystem in the same way, if they're not part of that group of companies. And then the other system, and we've already talked about a little bit, I think this is where blockchain comes in. I think that the technology has a lot of potential. It's, again, not there yet for sure. I think there's a lot of concerns and problems, but the idea of blockchains are neutral, they're permissionless, they're distributed, they're not preferential for one company or another. And so if you can have value of some sort, or an NFT that's tied to an item attached to the blockchain, the user then is the one that controls where that goes. They don't have to ask permission to do that. They don't have to ask, whether they want to pull their stuff off and move it to somewhere else. It's not just that simple, because then each platform actually has to be able to, if it's a 3D item, they have to be able to render that item if they can prove ownership of it for an NFT, for example. So it is a long road, but I think that that's where that kind of technology comes into this conversation. And there is a lot of work to do there. What that does do, I think, is empower individual users vis-a-vis companies. And that's why I say I think that the way that kind of user preference is moving into the future is going to shape the way industry decides how to be interoperable in the future and how these conversations go. Meta is involved in kind of leading a lot of global conversations on interoperability right now. It's a high priority for us. I think earlier panel talked about there's this new kind of WEF working group on interoperability that Meta is part of, and a lot of industry groups are part of. So we are working towards that, but it is definitely going to be a long road.
I want to bring in a buzzword that we've heard a lot about, which is walled gardens. Everyone seems to have an opinion about whether or not we should be breaking down the walls of these gardens. Daniel, I want to start with you here. Should we be worried about companies adopting this kind of model as they're trying to build up the metaverse?
Yeah, so I think that of course directly relates to the interoperability question, and I think it is a case of underappreciated how hard interoperability would be in this space. Even I commend the work Meta is doing. I think it is, if you think about what do we have that's interoperable today, even on the internet, right? I mean, we have basic protocols for exchanging data, TCP, IP, UDP, these types of things. But at the application level, email, that's probably the closest we've got. And even there, you have HTML versus text-based, right? It's not completely, you have, secure encrypted email and non-encrypted email. We have, mobile devices, right? Where we have multiple, if you actually try and build a mobile app, you have to build it for Android and iOS and maybe a long tail of some other ones. And you have to design it for multiple screens. You build a website, we think, oh yeah, you just do it in HTML. Well, no, you also have to render it in all these. It is so complicated to do interoperability that I think that is the reason, we do have walled gardens, and that's where a lot of innovation will occur in the near term. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think, in terms of, seeing this technology progress, it will require, the stakeholders that want to come together and build something together and cooperate to be able to succeed and put those resources together. I'm actually concerned that, this is again an area where there can be unintended consequences of, regulators or others moving too fast and saying, well, let's make sure everything's open. But is that coming at the expense of actual innovation? I mean, we look at something like, the European Commission recently, pushing the, charger standards, USB-C. That's arguably good, but for, people that want to get rid of things, but also USB-C has still many types of USB-C standards. Is it Thunderbolt? Is it 3.1, 3.2? I mean, there's still all these other things that go into it. The idea that we're going to just solve all these problems by issuing one declaration and there'll be no consequences, I think, just it's wishful thinking that is not backed up by reality.
I'll say I think in my bag here, both USB-C and Lightning Bolt chargers for my 2 Apple devices. So I think I'm pro standardization here, but I take your point. Marília, did you want to jump in here on this question?
Yes, I think that I agree. And I think that one additional reason why it's difficult to break the walled garden, so to speak, is that a lot of the business models of the companies that we have today that probably will translate to some extent into the metaverse is the monetization of personal data. So the metaverse provider will control its relationship with users by making them abide to the terms of service of the metaverse. And the terms of service will certainly include the possibility of collecting data for a better user experience or for targeted advertising. So the model of selling users' preferences to advertisers can be very easily extended to the metaverse. So I don't see right now the incentives for companies to stop exploiting this model unless there is a political policy backlash and it becomes insurmountable. To the contrary, I think that perhaps there are 2 additional points that could make personal data collection even more important. One of them is the pressure to assert liability for actions in the metaverse, which could be stronger than what we see today on social media for different reasons, and the increasingly tight link between online and offline shopping experiences, which will encourage companies to peg perhaps digital identities to traditional identities more closely. So this idea that we should hoard users and collect their data to some extent to monetize on top of it, it's one of the reasons why platforms sometimes prefer to keep these spaces closed so they can have the data for their business models.
Ash, I see you nodding along here. Did you want to jump in?
Mostly, I just have a lot of anti-Apple dialogue. That's not even interesting about setting bad precedents and controlling these ones, but very much agree with especially the last bit from Mario.
Cody, Daniel, do you either of you want to just weigh in broadly on like how we ought to be thinking about data and the sort of vast pool of data that's going to be associated with the metaverse and how this is going to be, you know, driving our economy going forward? Like, what are the questions that you two are thinking about broadly about the economics of data here? Daniel, start with you.
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of my work looks at data, and I thought the comparison in the economic study that was presented yesterday to mobile phones was really interesting, but I don't know if, you know, a lot of the value from mobile phones came from mobile data, right? Like the ability to figure out where there's traffic on the roads, that's a huge economic benefit. The ability to figure out where people are going. So I think there was huge value there. And with AR, VR, I think it's a lot more incremental, that value. You know, it wasn't this huge revolution in terms of data, or won't necessarily be in the short term. In the long term, I think it certainly could be if we're talking about, you know, wearing headsets, and, you know, in this room, we're all collecting data about what's around us. I mean, that kind of data, sure, that's another level, but I think that's pretty far away. In the short term, I don't think there's going to be this massive change in data collection and use in terms of like creating new value. It will be in terms of creating, you know, new risk, in terms of creating, you know, new types of applications. But I think that mobile data is a level of, you know, a leap that we haven't seen before and likely won't see for a while. So I think that's one part of it. I do think the idea though of basically data assets that people are buying and selling, that is going to be a huge part of the metaverse, and that's something that I think we're still wrestling with as a concept. You know, there's a lot of people who, you know, think about copyright and have struggled with how do we apply copyright in the internet era. You know, in thinking about that in the metaverse, you know, what happens when you want to, you know, right now, if you want to get out a guitar and sing a song, you have these performance rights, and, you know, but if you start streaming it, well, that's a little different. If you're streaming it to a platform, if the platform's monetizing, you start getting into layers, and then, you know, whether that's someone in the metaverse recording that performance and then selling it. So I think there's a lot of really interesting questions that come up in terms of that type of data around data assets and IP that we really haven't gotten into, but that will be really important to think about, especially things like, you know, for sale doctrine that are a core part of our economic models of working in the physical world, and how should we apply that in the metaverse if we want to maybe think that, well, some of those offline models are better than what we have for the internet today.
Cody?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that come to mind. Let's see if I can tie them all together. So the first thing, just going back to our conversation about interoperability, I think data and interoperability, you know, I've been talking about it mostly in the context of like digital goods, for example, like or maybe like currency. But interoperability data has significant privacy implications, right? When we're talking about platforms collecting data about an individual and trying to build interoperability between platforms, that's something that we really have to be very careful with, and how we think about it and how we address that. And, you know, I think something that you were talking about, I think inferring a little bit earlier, when we have these new headsets that are collecting new data, especially for bystanders, people that don't necessarily know that it's collecting data. We're doing a lot of very deep thinking about how we make sure people do know, how do we build kind of awareness, cultural awareness, that these are new devices that collect data about the places in which, you know, they exist just by you know, if they're turned on in that space. How do we make sure that we're minimizing the use of the data, how we're collecting, you know, only what is essential to, you know, for the provision of services. And so, you know, as we develop these devices, we're doing a lot of thinking about that, because we definitely don't want to create a device that makes people feel unsafe, certainly in the room, you know, with somebody else that's using it. But I do want to talk a little bit about what we are, I think it's hard to say what the business model of the say, most successful business model of the metaverse is going to be, right? I think we've all talked about how kind of uncertain this is, how long it's going to take to kind of realize. But I want to talk a little bit about what we are doing today that I think is indicative of the way that kind of Meta is thinking about it. And that's our kind of seed for the metaverse, if you will, is this new platform called Horizon Worlds that we're building. It's VR accessible. Anybody with a VR, a Meta VR headset can download this app for free, and they can access these creator tools for free to just build worlds, whatever they want. They can build 3D polygons. They can code those things to script them to act in certain ways. They can create games. They can create social experiences, whatever. And this is when I talk about the creator economy. This is really what we're actively doing to enable people to make a space that find their audience. And then what we're kind of just started releasing is ways that they can build a business on that space, that they can find a community that can base some sort of commerce on that as well. So there are just a ton of different applications of this. I mean, really the plan of the future is to allow creators to monetize their worlds in the ways that they or that's most appropriate for the community. Maybe it is the purchasing of in-world items. Maybe it's selling event tickets. Maybe it's subscriptions or something like that. And I think it's indicative of our kind of social first vision that one of the most successful worlds so far in Horizon Worlds is a comedy club. I mean, it's like literally people go tell jokes in VR and it has made almost more money than any other worlds in the metaverse. I think that's really telling of like, there is demand for this for people to find their communities in a social way, it's not just gaming. What I did not talk about were ads. That's not something that we're doing on the front end, right? We're doing this creator economy in the metaverse. That is kind of our first thing that we're doing. I think that ads will be part of the metaverse. I don't know what they're going to look like. I don't know what kind of data they're going to use for personalization. I mean, those are kind of conversations that are ongoing within our company and within, I think, across the industry. Because I think that just generally going back to consumer expectations, there are just different expectations of what ads look like. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to be walking around in VR getting pop-ups all around their face as they're walking around, right? There's going to be some other kind of way that we integrate those in the future.
Okay, let me pause here and see if anybody in the room wants to ask a question at this point. Otherwise, I can keep quizzing our panelists. Can we have a microphone, please? Over here.
Thank you. Two remarks. The first one is there are three ways basically to do standardization. One is that there's a fight between one or two competitors, the Betamax, VHS, and one wins. Second one is a more distributed ecosystem where a group of actors see that they have a common interest in having a standard. They create something by ISO and everybody sticks with the standard. And the third way is that somebody comes out of nowhere and invents something that establishes as a standard. Think barcodes, standardization of containers, and so on. Or the World Wide Web, or even the internet, when other people are networking large companies. I don't know how it's going to work, but maybe harmonization or interoperability will come by a group of actors who will be fed up with the battle or whatever, and they will propose something that people will agree with. I don't know. The point I wanted to make is, and ask you about, is in a large number of sectors, we are familiar with now duopolies. You have the Xbox and the PlayStation, and they coexist. You have the Android and the iOS. We have at the moment in rendering engines, a duopoly of sorts of Unity and Unreal. We can perfectly imagine that interoperability is going to be like what we have with Android and iOS and the co-development of terminals that will be different. How do you see the evolution of this portion? Because there are many layers in the stack. This portion of standardization with two rendering platforms and the interfacing or the interaction with the two modalities, which are rendering on the device or rendering in the cloud. Because it's not the same kind of situation for the interoperability. Or is the picture I'm painting completely wrong and it doesn't fit at all with the way you analyze it, which would be interesting as well.
Ash, did you want to jump in here? Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, I think think the two layers that you're describing, I think both of them will have a multitude of players, most likely similar to what we're seeing with the current dualities. I think the layer that particularly needs to be interoperable are the layers above that even. The layers where normally these pieces of information belong to either some of the companies that are tracking certain pieces of our information, our smart fridges, our smart watches, things like that, the super close and personal data, but also the information that normally we've left for the last several centuries to be information that the government's tracked. I think that level of interoperability, that's the one that's going to be extra special tricky. And two, I can't quite see who asked the question, but accent-wise, possibly this is actually, if you were the panelists from the first session yesterday, who had the really great point on borders and fragmentation and the impact that happened after the printing press in the 30 Years' War. I think we'll also see that happen. And I think that will further shape any form of standardization that we attempt to have or interoperability that we attempt to have. I think even our presumption that the nation states will remain the same in a metaverse, where it essentially shifts any geospatial properties that have tied us together as national entities. Because these are relatively new constructs in a larger spectrum of human time. And we often just assume that they're going to be there, as much as I absolutely maniacally adore many of the folks that I know on the previous panel, the intelligence community. I think there's a presumption there of the US will remain as is, but the metaverse moves us across borders, and we've already seen 2 other, if not 3 areas already kind of have to figure out ways around that, have to figure out interoperability in order to push us beyond something without fragmenting the nation states, but it's starting to fragment them. We have the remote work trend that's resulted in all of these visas, all of these things. Even before that, we had multinational companies trying to figure out the tax situation. And it's things like taxes that tend to drive even people kind of coalescing around some form of government. If the majority of people are working and living and acting within a metaverse, well, then maybe something in there should be doing the taxing, or as mentioned often earlier, the policing. Because it doesn't necessarily become as physical. Our cultural mindset, our semiotics of even how we understand and symbolize the world has already shifted profoundly. We see that in the gaming community. People are no longer like, I'm from this place, you play this game, you're in this community. And I think that's a little bit more, it's a social concept that harkens back to older social concepts, but also points out the fallacy of the current one that we have in post-industrial society. Sorry, anthropologist hat on for a second. Sorry, guys.
Did anybody else want to jump in on this question?
I would just briefly say, I think, I don't know is the answer, but I think that it gets at a really interesting point where it's like a level deeper on this question of interoperability of like, what is actually interoperable, right? There's all these different elements of what we're talking about that could be made interoperable. And again, a lot of what I've been talking about is more about, proof of ownership more than anything else. Like, do you own a digital item, or do you own like this value of some sort as it moves across platforms? But when it comes to, rendering that item in, 2 different platforms that use different, 3D engines, that's a whole nother question. So it is a really interesting one.
I'll just add, think about Flash, right? Arguably Apple killed Flash when it made the decision, we're not going to support it anymore, but presumably driven by performance and user demand. So I think there's also interesting questions about who is in the position to make decisions about which standards survive.
All right, so let's move on to the next one. I've got a hand in the back here. Do we have a microphone carrier or? Thank you. All right, Bertrand's volunteering. Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Is it on? Hello.
We don't have standardized microphones.
There's a small button in the middle. It's not very good.
Hello. Yes. Question, this is more economics or more of a asking you to speculate on economics with a putting on your thinking cap kind of perspective. We have economic theories that schools of thought that specifically deal with the material world and have been developed for the material world, which has certain limitations that are not in the metaverse. Of course, we can go back a decade or two, and with internet economy and the idea that there are network economies because you have the internet, meaning how you're connected or how many times you're connected. What is the web of different connections is a measure, a metric to how your economic value redefined in the internet world. In the metaverse, what kind of economic challenges or problems do we need to solve in order to have an economic model that will work in the metaverse? And I sort of propose this is what should be called meta economics. So I'm coining that term. I will trademark it. What problems should it solve that are not solved now?
Anybody want to go first, or I can call on someone? Marília, we didn't hear from you on the last one. Do you have any thoughts on this difficult one?
Sure. Well, I think that the first thing that strikes me a lot is how much we're still struggling to measure the digital economy on the internet. We see every meeting from UNCTAD or the WTO new manuals that are being published, and there are some areas of the digital economy that still countries find very hard to measure, such as, for instance, social media, because there's no monetary transaction between the user and the platform in the provision of this service. Therefore, that falls out of the GDP boundary. That therefore, where do they place this in terms of economics and measurement? So that will change a lot on the way that we are trying to measure the internet. And I think that this will be, I don't have an answer to your question, but I think this will be a very big challenge. And in addition to that, I think that the metaverse will just show that the gap that we have today between trade law and real practice of trade has become completely unsustainable. Our services, trade norms have not been updated since the approval of the General Agreement on Trading Services. We are still struggling with the very basic issues in this area, such as services classification. We struggle to assert countries' levels of commitments when it comes to digital products in the market today, such as online gaming. And in addition, we don't have any governance frameworks that are holistic and comprehensive on data flows. The metaverse is extremely data intensive. That's another aspect of the digital economy that we are struggling to measure. And currently we have a proliferation of data localization norms in developed and developing countries. So the lack of common rules of the game when it comes to data flows could pose a real obstacle to the seamless experience and fully interoperable experience in the metaverse across jurisdictions that we want to promote. So I don't have an answer to your question, but that will be a real challenge.
Let me add on one more economic theory question, and Daniel, we can get to yours, which is related to this, but do we really think that there's no scarcity in the metaverse? Because this is a sort of presumption that goes into a lot of thinking about, digital innovation, is that things that we can make in the internet are somehow infinite. But of course they require resources, right? The digital twin of my shoes is not free. And I wonder if anyone here has any thoughts on this question about, how resource constrained we actually are in the metaverse versus how much we hope we won't be. Daniel?
Well, yeah, I wanted to weigh in a little bit on that question as well. You're right, they're connected. Because I think it's a very interesting question in terms of, thinking about how social defined the internet in terms of value. And, I think that the network part, the value of your personal network or, as a business, whatever, the network part will still matter. I think there's also questions that might arise of access. I mean, think about passports today, right? People have extra value if you have a passport from a certain country. And, so you might have something equivalent to that in the metaverse, what different types of, whether it's platforms or spaces within the metaverse, whatever that you have access to. I think currency will likely, if we're talking about different types of virtual currency, that's another area where, at some point, two businesses or people might be relatively equivalent, but one is, sunk in one currency, another's in another, and those are fluctuating at different rates. So I think currency is something new there. And I think geography, which gets also to the question of scarcity. We're talking about spatial computing, but we're not talking too much about the space in which this is happening. And the geography here is crucial. And so I think all of those will be new dimensions or layers. It'll be interesting to see how they interact and intersect with how value is created for different entities. And I love that you're trademarking it, but of course your trademark won't apply in the metaverse, or maybe in my metaverse that I'm working in. So there'll be questions of law too, and how those all overlap. But I do think the scarcity question is one that's really interesting, especially when we think about governance of the metaverse, because if we think about scarcity is the defining reason that the internet has, we have Ankeny, we have all these ways of governing, because we said, well, there's this limited resource and we're going to create a system to govern that. And I think we have to, if we want to do something similar for governance for the metaverse, we have to think about what is that scarce resource that we are going to collectively agree we're going to manage through multi-stakeholder forum. And I think that could be, just like, you think about domain names. I mean, there's no reason the domain name space that we use today is the domain name space, right? I mean, you can create your own, anyone can create, any business can have their own, and there are random ones out there. But this is the one we've all decided to use. And so it has enormous, billion, $1 trillion value, right? And so can we do something like that for the metaverse? I think that's possible. Whether it will happen is kind of an open question.
Cody, Ash, did either of you want to come in on this?
I might kind of do a little bit of this sort of been said a little bit, but I think a lot of the real world kind of economic policy questions that exist today for the digital space still are relevant, if not more so. So like, as we heard earlier, I think trade discussions about cross-border data flows and data localization, cross-border, cooperation and alignment, if possible, on things like privacy and cybersecurity. This allows kind of, the metaverse is being built on the internet, right? So all this stuff is still relevant, as are things like digital tax, for example, which has been an ongoing conversation. I think one element too of kind of real world economics is that when we're talking about XR devices, this is a whole new class of devices that has almost no existing supply chains. So where's the manufacturing going to happen? So I think this is really actually an opportunity for a lot of governments to think about, that maybe felt like they missed out on kind of the mobile manufacturing wave. Like if you want to create manufacturing jobs, there are devices coming, right? So this is something to think about. The IP question is really interesting. I mean, I think from my perspective, thinking about the creator economy and like interoperability of digital items, these sorts of things, like who owns the IP of that item, right? Is it licensed or is it owned? Or if it's minted on an NFT, who owns that? If you're the person that owns it in your wallet, then you must own the IP. I don't know. Really interesting questions. I think things that we haven't really thought about, in detail yet, and something that's going to be relevant, for this thing to grow. Yeah, I think the scarcity question is super fascinating. I don't know that I have a good answer for that, other than I think it's, just thinking off the top of my head, I think, when you're talking about building markets, right, and economic kind of activity and business models, if you don't have scarcity, it's kind of, what are you selling, right? Like if you can have as many as if there's no kind of shortage of a thing, I think that makes it really hard. And that's why in places like Decentraland and these other kind of, Web3 native places, they create scarcity around property so that it actually has value. Because if it was limitless land, then there'd be very little value associated with that, if any. Right. And when we're talking about the creator economy, there are people that are spending time making these things. And so if they're spending time making these things in these spaces and the experiences, how do they create some sort of economic value out of that? But I do think that there's certainly an argument to say, any scarcity is artificial. And so like, how do we think about that in terms of making the user experience the best possible, while also making sure that creators can be successful on platforms?
Ash, did you want to?
Yeah, I think it's kind of telling that we all, I think, would have bits of I don't knows in here, because I think what this actually reveals is a really interesting tradecraft discrepancy with respect to, I think, technology at large today, technology in society, wherein we do have disciplines, anthropology, sociology. A gentleman in the previous panel also noted it, but these aren't necessarily, the social sciences aren't necessarily as involved in the STEM build of all of these things. We've left out the STEAM. in many of these situations, the tech companies don't hire for it in most situations. It's not something high on the government's list either. The majority of the intelligence communities are economists, I can't even say words, sorry, I've been up forever. Economists and electrical engineers. When the CIA was set up, it was supposed to be social scientists, historians, geographers. We've moved away from actually how do we study what people are going to do, what economic models we should have, which I know should sound like it should be the economists, but that's actually not what they do. It's very confusing when it comes down to that. But this is where I think it is really interesting with respect to what China has been doing. And even some of the data we got flashed earlier, the beginning keynote, those studies that Alvin flashed up, those are the studies that would start answering a lot of our questions, but we're not putting them into play. Our governments aren't instituting and putting money towards actually studying the impacts of the HMDs on engagement towards this or this or this. It's happening ad hoc in research universities or in private corporate labs, some of which will publish, some of which won't. A lot of it will get drowned out in the noise of just kind of the general academic scurry, because it's not necessarily there to be data points towards a useful build of something. It's there for the sort of ego career stroke of the people that were doing it, because that's the system we've built around what's happening. And this has been part of China's playbook as well, recruiting academics in some of these fields to China, promising you won't have to publish or perish, you won't have to do things, you can actually try to solve these questions, try to figure out what is the future state of these things so that we can build it accurately. And this is why there's such an interesting play happening there, as well as in other places. That chart you showed earlier of which nations are likely to get the flag above metaverse, I think it will be China, South Korea, or Australia, because those are the ones who've been building up the academic cred, trying to put money towards some of these questions and trying to answer them ahead of the game, trying to create visa programs and new ways to bring in people who are going to answer those questions as well as build things. Because I don't think until we actually run a lot of experiments, run a lot of social thought experiments, run a lot of red team, blue team exercises, we can even start to answer those questions. And even then, we probably won't have a solid answer, because whatever the resulting thing is, whatever the metaverse goes on to be called or whatever it is, just like the internet, it's going to have so many facets that nobody could have ever predicted.
All right, more audience questions. There's one in the back, and then we're going to go to the front.
I'm surprised nobody mentioned human attention as a scarce resource in the metaverse, because if the grand vision for the metaverse is basically social media in 3D, that's a scarce resource that is finite, especially because old media don't go away when new media come. People still read books. People still will be on the internet. People still watch TV. And this will be yet another possibility for human attention. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
All right, who has the attention span to answer this question? Would anybody like to jump in on this one?
I'm happy to dig in, but you also have to take me off the soapbox, because otherwise I'll just railroad and babble and everything. Yeah, no, I think it's gonna come down to attention and time. I'm quite fond of I think it's the Think book, the world painted in data. Not just even our interactions with it, but think about all the things that we've already swathed on the real world to try to direct us around things. Street signs, early physical augmented reality. We have augmented the world around us to do these things. We have so many other layers of that we can activate, turn on, turn off, use, play with. It won't just be social, it won't just be play. It'll be our HVAC systems being so smart that they can tell the next person who comes in to repair it, here's all your information, here's the spatial mechanism for these things, which sounds really boring, but it will eventually come down to time, energy, resources, more so even than specific attention spans towards your chosen activity. There will be a whirlwind of stuff going on, even if you're not necessarily looking at it, to ensure that when you do look at it and engage with it, that it has the most up-to-date information for you, as well as for it to keep responding to you. That, I don't know if that actually answers your question, but it is a very interesting point, because scarcity wise, really the only limit is our time and attention. And even then, some of those things can be simulated and automated in terms of some of our interactions and mining and things. I'm thinking with specific reference to gaming parallels, where even though that also should be a matter of attention and time to determine how well you can progress in a game, there's whole firms set up for you to basically have somebody play on your behalf to then send you all the rewards they reap so that you get farther ahead in X, Y, or Z.
Just, yeah, I think I love that question, but I also one of the things that strikes me is we had so many conversations around attention related to privacy and people's concerns about advertising and privacy in the metaverse. But one thing that is also a scarce resource are advertising dollars, right? So there's this idea that the metaverse might be flooded with advertising. Well, if this is advertising that's paid for, someone has to be paying for that. And so either there's less advertising on the internet and on billboards and on other things, or it's not migrating to the metaverse. Just like the shift in advertising dollars has made it so that newspapers, right, don't have the same advertising funding coming in. So I think that is also something that we have to think about in terms of scarcity. The impact of the metaverse will not just be on changing how we use the metaverse, will be on changing how the existing internet is funded, if that is in fact driven by advertising dollars, or it will be the advertising dollars don't go to the metaverse because other economic models exist there, and it stays and it goes to other places. So I think that's something that we also have to kind of sometimes forget, that it's not unlimited. That also doesn't just scale infinitely.
I'll say on the attention question, I noticed in the last panel that Carnal was talking about the limits of cognitive capacity, and I imagine there's going to be some poor grunts who are going to find out what those limits are as they go through training. But in any case, let's have one more question here for the front. Yeah, you go ahead.
Hi, my concern is about the data literated. In Brave New World, the biggest problem for the alpha and the betas never was the omegas, was the savages, because they're outside the society. Case in point, in Brazil, we used to have a factory becoming in early 2000s that microservice, and they produce, they manufacture CD players, a CD for $40. They have around 250 to 500 employees. Sony went to Brazil and they established a very automatic factory, making CDs for $15 and having only 25 employees. Yes, they earn a lot of money. However, the other people just lost the job for good. I keep hearing that with all the advancement, you're gonna have new jobs, but what gonna be those jobs? Because I can't see this replacement. I see lower paying jobs and higher paying jobs, but the middle class is vanishing.
All right, Marília, do you have any thoughts here on this question of what's happening to jobs?
Yes, that's a very, very interesting topic, because some people argue that the metaverse will not only create new job profiles, with which I agree, we will have fashion designers and many game developers. And I think there's a real opportunity for people who need to reskill and upskill to engage in this space. And some people argue that it will reduce bias, such as related to gender, race, providing a more equal playing field in the labor market. I think that I would add to that it is very interesting that in a moment post-globalization, as some people are calling it, or at least in a moment of real globalization backlash, the metaverse is being treated as a way to promote global market integration, because avatars can move around across the metaverse without time delay, at no cost, while individuals themselves are increasingly localized and limited in their experience to travel the world for different barriers, be it health or national security or economic policy. So I hope that this is not really where we're heading in terms of metaverse, that our avatars are more free than we are. But when it comes to the labor markets, I think that many non-tariff barriers that we see today that touch upon the labor market could easily be translated into the metaverse. I think that, for instance, requirements of certain qualifications to exert professions elsewhere. If you are offering your services to the inhabitants of the metaverse of a different space, which could be connected to a country, you could be required to show some credentials as you need to show in the offline world today. And this is something very entrenched in the labor market to protect some professions, to make sure that the adequate level of service is being offered. So I think there will be a mix of changes and new opportunities, but also a lot of what we have today at the labor market being translated into the metaverse, because after all, it's a space that will run on top of what we have in terms of laws and jurisdictions, not completely separated from what we have.
Ash, did you want to go?
So I think my grand hope for the metaverse is that we get to the point of full-scale digitization of one-to-one, like full Borjas like replication of our world, because then it's not just the metaverse layers for us to play, it's automation systems around us. It's Rosie the maid has always been one of my favorite ones to use in government debriefs. Like that's how you get that in your house, having everything checked and monitored for you to engage with and be part of the playing field, really. And in that mechanism, I have a profound hope that we as data points are the monetization system, not as advertisements, not as us even buying things, just as us interacting. I think we see that in the gaming industry right now. I don't think people are paid as well as they could be, but there is a huge portion of folks on Twitch who make a decent living, much more than they would make minimum wage in many states, by sitting online, playing with their friends, having those interactions through Twitch, through the game, through whichever game client, Steam, Xbox, whatever that they're using, be these multi-layered systems. Those things are all tracking them, allowing them to play, and returning the favor by giving them this income that allows them to do that. And I think that is profoundly interesting. And if we get to a point where the computer vision systems all around us, whether that is like constant LiDAR in the corners or what have you, where we're the data that keeps the system going, and allows us to then interact with the other layers that are economically feasible, then it becomes not so much a question of where the new jobs, but us technologying ourselves out of having to do all of the crazy post-industrial things we do for 9-to-5 jobs to satisfy our current sort of system. And I think that would be a really, really interesting push to make. I know that sounds terrifying and so utopian and so like, oh my gosh, we'll never get there. And yet for centuries, this is what our science fiction has kind of hoped we'll get to. This is Star Trek. They have the creative scientific jobs. Most of the other things are kind of automated, and there is no money in Star Trek. I feel like that gets left out of the whole system sometimes. They are the money, the data, the information, the intelligence they gather, the relationships they build, the networks they bring. That is what is of the value to the civilization of the future. And I think that grand hope of mine is that if we go full scale spatial computing, full scale metaverse down the end, we could get to that, because it'd be way cooler to just everybody just exist, go about your daily lives, pick some hobbies, do what there's some great studies on the Anglican priests of the 1700s and 1800s actually combined. It wasn't a very hard job they had. They turned up on Sunday, they could each pursue their own pursuits. The most patents, it was engineers, biomedical technology breakthroughs, all of these amazing things when people actually had enough time to think and be creative. We know scarcity in the physical world stops people being creative. If we could come up with a mechanism where just existing, doing your thing, running your experiments, building whatever it is you wanted to build for the metaverse, for the physical world, is itself your economy, it would be amazing. Naive of me maybe to think this, but.
Cody?
Yeah, if I can, I actually want to address the question about attention first. I didn't raise my hand aggressively enough. Because I think it's a really interesting one, and I appreciate you asking it. And I think I'll share a couple of my personal experiences because I have a VR headset that I'm working through Resident Evil right now. It's a great game, and so I've been spending a lot of time on it, and like playing different games and experiencing the different kind of social apps that are on there. And one thing that's kind of cool about VR is when you take it off, it's off, right? Like you can't doom scroll in your bed with a VR headset on. So I think that's one thing that's telling of kind of the platform. When you're in it, you're in it, right? You're focused on what you're doing. And I think that makes, when we talked a lot about virtual presence, it just makes that more meaningful because you're present, even though it is in the digital space. The other thing that our company is doing and thinking a lot about is how can you, even though people want to be using their devices, how can they be more present while using their devices? And like one of the products that we recently put out was Ray-Ban Stories. You might have seen it has cameras and the lenses, and you can like click a button to take pictures. So I have a pair of these, and in terms of like being present while taking pictures, it's incredible. I don't have to pull out my phone anymore and like find the viewfinder and take a picture of my daughter playing and like, oh, I missed it, because I just click a button and then I move on with my day. And so I think there are some, like we're thinking a lot about in future form factors of AR devices, how can you enable people to be present while still getting the kind of information that they desire, in an efficient way. So, though, I think that your point about, hey, the old media doesn't go away is really interesting. I think that's a good point. But these are some things I think that we're thinking about to make it so it's not, you don't have to be staring at a thing in order to interface with the digital space in the same way. On your question, I think it's a really good one and a really hard one. I think, the reality is, if we look at the historical record, every time there's a big technological revolution, there's a lot of labor disruption, right? A disruption in the labor market. A lot of people displaced, jobs become irrelevant, new jobs are created, but people that lose their jobs aren't necessarily a good fit for the new job, right? And so my hope, it's kind of a pacing thing, right? And it's like a timing issue as much as anything else. My hope is the focus on kind of the creator economy will allow some people at least to really do what they love and kind of creating for building communities in these digital spaces. And we're trying to make the tools as accessible as possible, so you don't have to be a coder in order to go in and use them. You can kind of go in. I mean, there's a learning curve. We're creating, resources to help people learn how to do that. But I think that's an avenue for some people, right? It's not going to be everybody. There are going to be some people that are just, that's not going to be their thing, and we're going to have to come up with other solutions for those people. But I don't think that those problems are unique to the advent of the metaverse, right? These are problems that have existed kind of for hundreds of years whenever there's a big technological revolution, and something that I think government has a real role to play in like helping society adjust to technological changes.
All right, I think I saw two last hands, so let me make sure we get both of those. So you up here in the front. Okay, we'll get the last three questions here in the tie-dye in the back, and then this gentleman here.
Thank you. Is the business model of the metaverse going to require all of us to subscribe to the same things? Just to give two examples, the good people of Seoul seem to stand in line for driver's licenses, and they seem to want to do that in the metaverse. I don't stand in line for a driver's license. I can't think of anything more awful than being treated by a DMV avatar who would be as rude as the ones they've got now. I do that online, it comes. If I want to go to Paris, I don't want a 3D printer to bring me some dinner that I've by chance seen a lovely restaurant full of French-speaking people. I look at the menu, I go in, a greeter greets me with condescension, a waiter is marginally polite, and then I have the most wonderful dinner. I don't want it served by the robot that cleaned my house earlier in the day. That's my asking, because the metaverse did that. So I'm just wondering, and there may be other things I'd be delighted to be in the metaverse for. But is your business model or the business model or the metaverse going to require us to be involved in a whole lot of services that we would never really want? Because we would actually be prepared to pay the carbon tax to get on a plane, and I'm sure the carbon tax is going to be big, to go to Paris and smell the subway, like we do now, because that's the experience we want, not a virtual experience. maybe that's a little hypothetical in this audience, but or existential and or meta in this audience, but I listen to all this and say, yeah, it sounds wonderful, but who's going to want to live in this world?
All right.
I know, well, exactly, and I'm a big believer in learning how to use all tools, and I use them all, but it's sort of, I can see a whole lot of joy, like all the things that they are.
All right. Yeah, hold on. We want to make sure we get all the questions in. So. Okay, down in the back there.
Can people hear me? Okay. So I had a question. So the old-fashioned non-upgradable part is the human and human brain. It's an easy simplification to make that in a new frame of reference, some undesirable things will fade away, like greed or malice or whatever. But if there are humans involved, shouldn't ethics and rules or laws involved with it? Regulatory humility seems to imply that laws hold innovation back. But would innovation without rules be certain to not result in a Star Trek happy land, but instead of in a dystopia?
All right. One more. Go for it.
So my question is more about the economy and the consumer safety in the metaverse or virtual environments. So for example, with 3.0, we're seeing the emergence of cryptocurrency and NFTs, and there's a lot of backlash because although, for example, it is a platform for creators, it's also a rug pull platform for a lot of celebrities and people who just want to get richer. Because of this, as a decentralized system, it's kind of losing its track sometimes. But when there is Meta to provide that system, in a more kind of legitimate and hopefully safer way, what are the kind of policies that are going into this to actually maybe limit those kind of rug pull or get rich quick schemes?
All right, here's what we're going to do because we don't have enough time to get substantive answers on all these things. I'm just going to give each of you 1 minute to wrap up and choose how you want to address these three excellent questions in your own way. So we're going to start with the in-person people and we'll let our remote guests wrap up. So Daniel, let's start with you. You got 1 minute.
Sure. Well, on the first question, who will use this? I mean, I think, yeah, nobody wants to just see Paris virtually, but I think there's a lot of places in the world that people would never visit, but they might try before they buy with VR, right? So I think that opens up just enormous possibilities for access opportunity. Also for deciding that what you don't want to go to this place, because look around, you realize it's not that great. And on the dystopia question, I think that's a great question. I mean, my point isn't unfettered capitalism or that we shouldn't have laws. My point is that we need guardrails, not roadblocks. We need to be thinking about, okay, if we see something starting to go bad, let's intervene. Let's have more regulatory sandboxes. We know what issues we should be looking out for, and then we know there's also be some unknowns. So let's focus on those. And I think that's a very different model though than saying we're afraid of the future and we're afraid of these bad things happening maybe 10 years from now. So we're going to take action today before we even see those because of concerns. So I think that's where the difference is.
Cody.
Yeah, so on the first question, I would just say, I think if there's demand, then there's market, right? I think that if people want to go to Paris to have bad service, I think that you can definitely, there's going to be a market for that. And there are going to be providers for that. I don't think anybody wants all physical interaction to go into the digital space. Nobody wants that, right? So I think there's still going to be markets, but there are some things that, to your example at DMV, I don't know. I mean, that's a way that governments can save a lot of taxpayer money to service. They don't have to maintain real estate. They don't have to maintain security. They don't have to patrol it. Then, all these different things where they can have cost savings. Where maybe if the service is still provided in an adequate way, maybe it makes sense in that case, right? So, but it's not something we're doing, right? This is how other people are going to be interacting in this space. And just on the NFT question, I think it's a really good question because I'm always kind of shocked at how much kind of cultural baggage such a new technology already has, and it's because there have been so many instances of rug pulls and scams and all these things. And we have not. I think we enable display of NFTs, of JPEG NFTs on Instagram and Facebook, but that's kind of as far as we've gone so far. And we're looking at how this technology might be able to enable kind of what I've been talking about into other kind of future use cases. and are thinking really deeply about how to do it safely. Because I mean, there's a business case for this, right? If people are on our platform and they're getting rug-pulled and they're getting scammed, like, no, we don't want that, right? We don't want our customers to have like a bad experience on the platform. But I think just from a responsibility perspective, like we have a responsibility to make sure that if we're integrating kind of this third-party technology onto our platforms, that it's done in a responsible way, that the users on the platform are educated in a way that they know how to use it responsibly, because it is a new technology. It does have kind of unique aspects to it and different types of kind of responsible user techniques and those sorts of things. And the identification of fraud and scams is different than in, you know, email. We're not getting like scam emails is a very different thing, and like the risk surface is very different. So we're doing a lot of thinking about how to do that.
All right, Cody, I'm going to cut you off because we're over time and I want to make sure that the women get the last word. So Ash, over to you.
Okay, rapid order. Towards the first question, I like to think about it not so much about what it's going to replace or take away, but what it's going to augment. It's not going to take away these phenomenological experiences. It's going to create new things, new interactions that we did not think possible. I mean, think about what if you describe the internet or social media or the telephone even to people in previous decades before those things existed, they would be like, oh, I don't want that. And then now, I mean, would you want to live without it? Maybe there will be a sort of a Luddite backlash, super conservative kind of rebellion movement. This is also possible. And to jumble questions 2 and 3 a little together, I think at first we're going to need so much protection and regulation for everybody, especially as Cody pointed out, like we don't even know what types of crime will entirely pop up. We see some of them already, but there will be many more. But towards the second question in between, I think there's an interesting thing here where if you're also monitoring the projection and kind of trajectory of brain-computer interface technology, and where even that level of monitoring would theoretically be possible and intertwined with all of the other things going on within the metaverse. Think of it as another wearable, essentially, except it's tracking your brain activity. You get to that sort of Santa Claus again, a surveillance system, and I know that sounds like a terrifying thing, but really, a lot of the research coming out of the Futurist Institutes, and I'll point you especially towards Nick Bostrom's Abominable World Hypothesis. There's very few paths through the upcoming extinction events that we have ahead of us. One of them for mass communication, mass world population, to get over the security dilemma that Alvin mentioned earlier, that would get us the lower defense budgets. We could lean into something like this and actually teach ourselves to just be better humans via being part of a system that is kind of tracking and monitoring and letting us know we're kind of being jerks about X, Y, or Z, or something like that. It doesn't really be tied like the social credit scores are in the 2 provinces in China that instituted that, but this is potentially where things could go with a metaverse that is both ethically viable and again rewards the people within it with a better world.
All right, final word. Go for it, really.
Right, with regards to the rush to regulate, I would also be against that policymakers rush to regulate the metaverse, simply because I think we have much more pressing issues that should be receiving much more attention that they are today, such as the Internet of Things, smart cities, wearables. These are issues that are here with us right now. And somehow I feel that things that are forthcoming, such as artificial general intelligence or the metaverse, sometimes they suck too much air in the room. It's excellent to have these spaces and debates like this. However, policymakers should focus their attention elsewhere. The place where we will need a lot of policy and regulation and international cooperation is to make sure that people get digitally included, because while we are talking about this move to the metaverse, we still have half of the world population that is not even connected, or that has a connection with a quality of service that will not sustain that metaverse. So are we creating a technology that will just make the gap between the included and excluded worse? Are we creating a technology that will enrich those that are already reached? How to make sure that the benefits of the digital economy get distributed? And I think this is an issue that relates to security as well. A report from the World Economic Forum 2 years ago called attention to the fact that concentration in the digital economy has become one of the top 10 risks to global stability. So we need to think about that much more carefully, how we move to the metaverse without leaving others behind. Thank you.
All right, let's give everyone a round of applause. Thank you very much.